right? um, so basically we'll just quickly cover the Redux in React and basically how it is implemented and what things it simplifies. I found the best way actually in out of many websites, like this is what I found may like quite useful. So just gonna walk through the same thing, and plus there is another GitHub repository, Redux Essential for Counter example. I found it like very good thanks to this guy, Mark Erickson, um, which has some typical application, and that code is also copied here. I'll just quickly walk through that. So before going into this GitHub repository, let's quickly understand what is Redux in React. Okay, I'm quickly gonna skip all these things and directly come here, the state management. So what's in state management? State management, so basically just consider it like kind of a persistent storage, temporarily I would say. um, why temporary? Because you refresh it and it goes, so it's not like a database and all that, so it's fine. So state management, it's a persistent storage, like you are maintaining the state of an application. So for example, if here in this case a counter component has been created, which has its counter as a state, right, which initiates with 0, and then increment method has been defined, which takes the previous counter added by 1 and set that counter, correct? Now the rendering piece of that component, so you see how all these things are together, uh, intertwined with each other. You have a state object maintained here itself, and then the logic to act on an state object, and eventually the rendering part of it as well. So rendering, like it's a button, and before that it shows some value, and if you click on an increment, this triggers this on click method, and which increase the state, and the value gets changed to that. So typically what they're saying here is like you are in a current state. So let's say your counter is 0, right, and this is your storage state, and that's what you see in your UI. Now you take an action, which is like clicking that button on an increment. Now once you take this action, which results into modifying that state, which means like now it modifies the value from 0 to 1, right? Now because of that modification, whichever view which have subscribed that on this state change they need the notification, they will get rendered, and that their view will get refreshed. So this is what a typical it is represented into this circle. So before going further, let's quickly I'll just quickly put and show you how it works. So this project is already, I have put it over here, so you see I just put the console just to show something, some logs and all. Let me clarify it for now. So this is a typical application which is already deployed here in my local host. Let's quickly add a component. So I can add my component in the let's start index.js, which goes app.js. It stores a counter. So this guy, okay, so this is a existing component counter, and that's what you see over here. I'm just below, I'm just copying pasting that code. Okay, so its name is conflicting, so let's give another name. I'm gonna call it counter2. Okay, so this I'm exposing another React component, simple copy paste with the increment as a button. On click, it should ideally increment my value. Once you put it over here, so which you also need to hold it in this class also where it is being invoked. So from this class, our component counter was exported. I'm exporting another function as well, export function counter2. Yes, so once you export counter2 is also available, and just another component over here. Okay, so yes, it is not looking very good, but at least it solves the purpose. Or let's put it up. Let's put it before logo. Okay, maybe it is looking a little better now. So yeah, so this is currently value 0. Now you increment, you click, you see the value gets changed because you just put this component over here. So that is what typically it is defined by this circle. So this is like a normal React component, and let's see what happens when we introduce Redux. I'm going to skip a lot of things. We can read. I'll put this link in the description. Immutability is pretty much like not mutating anybody's state. When we say mutate, which means you change something, the state. Everything whatever we do in Redux is supposed to be immutable, and that's what they are trying to explain over here. I'm gonna skip it. Yes, let's go through some kind of a terminologies. Action. So what is an action? Action is typically we click the button, right? That is an action. Action causes to raise some kind of an event. So typical action they are trying to describe here, and which is in Redux also, like at least these keys are important, so just keep a note of your type and payload. So this is a typical action you want to add in your to-do list, so that you define the type is like my to-do added, and a payload. So basically you want to buy a milk, right? So that becomes your action. So I think action is super simple. Now becomes the action creator, which means something which creates this action. So basically typically a function which actually creates or return this kind of an object. So add to do, that becomes your function. You provide a text to that, and then it returns this object type, and payload is like, let's say, text. So if you say add to do and then buy milk, so which is more or less you get a return this object. So action and action creator is like super simple. Reducer, so this is important. So you can read all that. Okay, so reducer is like, so let's take the same example we took last time. You are in a current state. So current state says my value is 0, and now you take an action on top of it, and that action is like, clicking that increment button. So you are in a current state, the data which value is 0, and then you take an action on it, like let's say increment. Now with the original state which is 0, you take an action on it. What becomes your new state? That becomes a value 1. So that's pretty much job of a reducer, which takes your state and an action on it, and what's your new state? It returns a new state. So typically if you see your reducer, it takes an state, it takes an action, and it returns a new state. A few things to remember. We just talked about immutability. So let's say you are in a current state, and let's say right now only supporting method is like increment. So if the action whatever you are taking, the type, remember the type and payload. So if your action is increment, whatever is in your state, just increment it by 1. Had it been like increment by some value, then at that time you can actually get the payload, and then you take the current state and add action.payload. Or if it is an inner object, just put that value over here, dot something. And if does not belong, just return the same state as is. And here like it's a triple dot state, and by doing this actually you make a copy of it, so you don't mutate original object. We'll quickly see with an example and understand like more details. As a programmer, you don't have to worry about immutability. You just write your code the way you are comfortable it, and like by mutating state and all that stuff. And Redux toolkit, the dev kit will behind the scene will take care of all that headache from us. Okay, let's move to the next one. Store. So store is the typically store, the name is also clear. It creates a store like where the data gets held The one very important thing with Redux is like, so we saw this component, right? This component. I'm gonna remove that. So let me just hide that out so we don't see it. Okay. So with this component, the state, the operation, action, and the view, everything is into one. Um, with Redux, how it changes that across the application, the global storage is maintained, and all these components are aware about this state, or at least the portion of the state which they have to deal with. And if that state change, the UI gets rendered. So this is like a difference between a normal component and like Redux, where the idea is to have a global or application wide storage. So I want to emphasize on that fact. Okay, so state, so it's like, you know, that Redux toolkit, you get a configure storage and you provide a reducer function to get the storage. Once you have the store, you can actually get the state for that. So I hope that action reducer, action creator, and store is clear. Let's move to dispatch. So dispatch is like okay, nice, triggering an event. Yes. So now you dispatch something. So you let's say increment it. So basically that operation or incrementing it. So you take that action and you basically, this action you dispatch, basically triggering that action. So this is like kind of a typical Redux terminologies. So that's what they are you know explaining over here. Okay. So now we know, so we saw the action creator. So we typically call the action creator to dispatch the right action. So basically usually when we store, we call a dispatch function. Instead of giving a direct action, we could have given just this payload as is. It is preferred to basically call an action creator. That's why you guys will see what action creator is doing over here. Okay, and finally the selector. Basically once you have a state, you can write your own selector method, which once you pass your state, it knows how to extract that value. So basically it's a select counter value, that selector. So typically if we summarized, this is a typical flow. The whatever the three circle you saw in a normal React component is transformed into this diagram. What it typically tries to say, the same thing we talked about, that you have a state and you take an action, and based on that state change. So if you see, this is the initial state, right? You deposit $10, and then the action takes, where a type is deposit and payload is 10. The previous state is 0 and the new state becomes 10, and your UI, whatever part of UI that get renders with $10. So this is the typical React Redux. Okay, I think that's summarized by saying the same, more or less the same thing. Let's quickly see that application. So this GitHub URL I will put in the link, but you guys actually can check out that code, and I just checked out that code, almost the same I have copied here, except a few styling, and basically I did a package of, I was playing with some styling, and package of JSON, where I just put home dot, which comes very handy when you deploy a local host or into an S3 bucket or into a local file system, if you want to just directly the index file, because it makes sure all the other CSS, JSON, and other styles are available relative to your index.html file. Okay, all right. So this is typically deployed, and we can see this application running over here. So let's refresh it. Let's clear it off. Refresh that. So application does nothing great, but it shows a lot of good concepts. You can add +1 plus, just clicking plus, it will increase this value, minus will reduce that. 2 3 4 5, I just put a 5 here for simplicity. You can add that amount, so 5 gets added, you keep adding it, it will keep adding it. And then there is another add asynchronous, which I'm giving a delay of 2 seconds to add this number over here. So if I click it after 2 seconds, that number gets modified to a new value. Okay, and I click once again, and then it becomes 55 after 2 seconds. You click this and quickly click this, so this adds this, and after 2 seconds this add on top of it. So this just illustrates that part of it. So once we see the application, so everything starts with an index.js. So this is your store, app store. Let's go there, this particular file. As said, you have to create your root store once, and that's what typically they are doing it. Most of these config store and all are available in toolkit. So you provide your own reducer. This is a naming convention which you usually follow. If you're like, let's say, doing it for counter, provide to give the prefix as counter, so that way you can actually arrange your application better. Okay, so once you provide your store, let's quickly see. Basically you have to give your reducer for that store. So this is typically we saw here when we create a store, we have to provide a reducer. So this is like the reducer part of it. Okay, there are many handy functions and methods which are available in this toolkit, which makes our life easy. Remember, one of them was like you don't have to typically take a load or headache of like making it immutable. This toolkit will take care of, like, that immutation. So allows us to write this, allows us to write mutating logic in the reducer. It doesn't actually mutate the state, because it behind the scene internally the library which detects changes and produces brand new immutable state, so we don't have to worry about it. So anyways, this is a very handy method from the toolkit. It has like typical name. You want to give a name to this slice and the initial state. So we are just dealing with our value function, which is value variable. Just initialize with value 1, and then you give all your reducers. So remember the reducer is like you have a current state and you take an action on it. It takes a state, it takes what action you have applied, and based on that it produces a new state. So for example, in this case I want to increment it by, let's say, $10. So I have my current state, I get the current value out of it. From the action, remember it's a two-part, the type and payload. Your payload is, let's say, coming as 10, whatever you're passing from outside. So from payload I'm passing an object, and this the value p, the value 10 will contain. So you just increment the amount and just produce a new state. So that's how it changes the state object. So for increment decrement it is even simpler. You don't need an action object, because your payload is always going to be 1 plus or minus. So that's how you do it over here. Okay, this is a very good thing provided by this slice function. So the action, so basically it takes all the keys in the reducer, right? It takes all the keys in the reducer, and slice.action will make them available as your action, and that's you hold it in the constant variables and export it so you can use in another part of your program. Okay, similarly increment async, so basically it uses Thunk. Thunk is basically behind the scene. You can do the asynchronous processing. So that's what you see the button, right? When you click add twice asynchronously with some delay, it was adding it over there. So that's pretty much about Thunk. It updates the states asynchronously. Okay, and then a selector. You have already seen an example in this document where we created that select counter value. So this is something similar to that. So nevertheless, you created your reducer over here, and from the index.js, we had done store, and then you pass that is that reducer. This becomes your root store. So which means uh, all your application will talk to one single global store. Okay, so now we have seen counter slice. The main part is now the counter.js, which is actually doing the rendering of the component. Um, so this counter slice, you just import it. So remember all this increment, decrement, all these things which you have exposed over here, they will be available over here. And then if you see the application, let me refresh it. If you see the application, the plus button and a minus button, this is a text box, add amount which does it synchronously, and add async which does it asynchronously. That typical UI logic is kept over here. So this is the button. So before going there, like, you just use a selector, comes from Redux, select count. So you have already exposed that selector. So that count is now available, which its initial state, which is 1. Once you have this count, you are just displaying it over here, right? So this is actually displayed over here. Now before that there's a plus button, after that there's a minus button. Now what should happen when we click on that? Of course it will mutate the state. So when you click on one, on click, you just need to remember, now you don't have to manually change some state and listen to that, and it will update it. You just trigger that event, and whatever part of the program, you don't have to, this piece of code doesn't need to bother about which all other piece of your components needs to get updated. They are anyway listening to this, and they will get the update and render that UI. So basically remember that once your state is changed, whatever piece of the UI, they will automatically render, as long as they are subscribed to that part of the state which gets changed. Okay. So once you click, just dispatch an increment event. Once you click minus, just dispatch a decrement event. And once you let's say whatever value kept over here, the increment amount, and once you click this add amount, whatever value in the text box is there, it will be increment by that amount. So that's pretty much about that. Covered. Yeah, that's pretty much. So this shows a very powerful concept of Redux and Thunk.